I had been driving for hours, chasing the horizon down a lonely highway that stretched through miles of desert. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in a cold, silvery glow. My gas gauge was hovering just above empty, and the nearest town was still a good 20 miles away. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier. The road seemed to go on forever, unchanging, with no signs of life. Then, as if by some strange coincidence, I saw someone standing by the side of the road, their thumb outstretched. A hitchhiker. They were dressed in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, their face obscured by shadows. Normally I wouldn't stop, especially not this late at night in the middle of nowhere, but something about them made me slow down. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was desperation for company. I rolled down the window as I came to a stop beside them. "Need a lift?" I asked. The hitchhiker nodded, stepping closer. "Thank you," they said, their voice low and gravelly. They climbed into the passenger seat, placing a small, weathered duffel bag on the floor between their feet. The air in the car immediately felt heavier, colder. "Where are you headed?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road. "Just up the way," they said, staring straight ahead. Something about their presence was unnerving. They sat perfectly still, their hands resting on their knees, not fidgeting or adjusting themselves. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably. I cleared my throat. "Bit late to be out here," I said, trying to break the tension. "Not many people take this road anymore," the hitchhiker replied, their tone distant. "Most know better." That comment sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" The hitchhiker turned to look at me for the first time. Their face was gaunt, their skin pale as bone, and their eyes were deep-set and unblinking. "This road, it's not what it seems." I laughed nervously. "You're being cryptic. Is that supposed to scare me?" "It's not a joke," they said, their voice firm. "This road is cursed. People who run out of gas here, they don't make it out." My hands tightened on the wheel. "Cursed? Like haunted?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. They just stared at me with those unsettling eyes. The gas gauge dipped below the red line and my heart sank. The engine sputtered slightly before catching itself. "That's not funny," I muttered. The hitchhiker leaned back, their gaze shifting to the road ahead. "You'll see." The headlights illuminated a strange shape in the distance, a car parked on the side of the road. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't just parked. It was abandoned. The windows were shattered, the tires flat. There was no sign of the driver. "That's not the first one," the hitchhiker said, their voice calm. "It won't be the last." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. Maybe it broke down. The hitchhiker didn't respond. A few miles later, another car appeared. This one was flipped on its roof, its metal frame twisted and blackened as if it had been set on fire. My stomach turned as I drove past. The desert was supposed to be empty, but these wrecks were everywhere now. "How do you know about this?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I've been here a long time," they said simply. The engine sputtered again, this time more violently. The car jerked forward before slowing, the gas gauge now completely empty. I pulled to the side of the road, my heart pounding. No, I whispered, turning the key repeatedly. The engine refused to start. The hitchhiker opened their door. "This is where I get off." "Wait," I called after them as they stepped out onto the sand. "What am I supposed to do now?" They turned back to me, their face unreadable. "Stay in the car. Don't leave, no matter what you hear." "Why?" I demanded. "Because they'll come for you," the hitchhiker said, their voice hollow. "And if you're outside, you won't stand a chance." With that, they walked off into the darkness, disappearing into the desert like a ghost. I locked the doors, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The night pressed in on all sides, impossibly dark. I told myself it was all some sick joke, that I'd wait for daylight, flag down another car, and laugh about this later. But then I heard it. A faint tapping on the back window. I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, they hurt. The tapping came again, louder this time. I turned my head slowly, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, just the endless stretch of darkness behind me. But the tapping continued, steady and insistent. And then it wasn't just tapping. It was whispers. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but full of malice. The car rocked slightly, as if something was circling it, brushing against the sides. I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating the hitchhiker's warning in my head. "Stay in the car. Don't leave." The whispers grew louder, the tapping turning into pounding. The windows began to fog up, handprints appearing on the glass from the outside. My heart raced, my chest tightening with panic. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I opened my eyes, my breath shaky. The windows were clear, the handprints gone, but in the rearview mirror, I saw something standing in the middle of the road behind me. It wasn't the hitchhiker. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and a face that was nothing but a gaping black void. The pounding returned, this time on the roof of the car. I screamed, cream covering my ears, but it did no good. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was a low, guttural voice whispering just for me, "You're out of gas." Story the end.
Story number 2.
It started as a typical road trip. I was heading out of town, eager for a weekend getaway, a break from the routine. The sky was clear, the sun setting in a blaze of orange, casting long shadows across the empty highway. I had planned my route, mapped out where I would stop, and filled the tank, or so I thought. It was about 2 hours into the drive when I noticed the gas gauge slowly dipping. No big deal, right? I had plenty of time to stop and fill up before it became an issue. But the longer I drove, the less sense it made. I hadn't passed a gas station for miles, and the road had become even more desolate. The sun was now just a thin sliver on the horizon, leaving the road in a growing twilight. I checked the gauge again, and this time it was almost on empty. Panic started to creep in. I hadn't seen a sign for a station in ages. I could turn back, but the thought of retracing my steps made my stomach churn, so I kept driving, hoping something would appear around the next bend. And then it happened. The engine sputtered. The car lurched forward, and a dull grinding noise filled the air. I tried to rev the engine, but it was no use. The car coasted to a stop on the side of the road. I cursed under my breath and put the car in park. I sat there for a moment, staring ahead at the pitch-black stretch of highway. Nothing. No lights in the distance, no sign of life, just empty road and darkness closing in. My phone had no signal. Fantastic. I looked around. The trees on either side of the road were thick, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. I wasn't exactly in the best place, but I figured the best thing to do was wait for another car to come by. Surely someone would pass me soon. So I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. The trees around me seemed to grow darker the farther I looked, their trunks like black pillars disappearing into the night. I shone the light in every direction, hoping to catch a glimpse of headlights. That's when I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. I froze. The figure was tall and thin, standing motionless, watching me. At first, I thought it was just some weird trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees, but then I noticed the way it didn't move with the breeze. My heart began to race. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow step toward me, then another. It didn't walk, not like a normal person. It glided, its feet barely skimming the ground. The flashlight beam flickered, and for a split second, the figure seemed to vanish, swallowed up by the night. But I knew it was still there. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like something was waiting. I backed up toward the car, my hand shaking as I gripped the flashlight. The figure had stopped moving, but it was still there in the periphery of my vision, just watching. Then I heard it, a low, rasping whisper, so faint I almost thought it was the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time, and I could make out a single word. Help. I froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading. It wasn't coming from the figure, though. It was coming from inside the woods, deeper in the trees. My heart hammered in my chest. There was someone else out there, or something else. The wind picked up, the trees swaying more violently now, and I could feel the temperature drop. It was getting colder by the second. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could hear the crunch of leaves behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. I grabbed the door handle, desperate to get back inside the car. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my hands trembling as I tried to unlock the door. The whispers grew louder, now multiple voices, overlapping, pleading. Help us. Don't leave. I managed to get the door open and slid inside, locking it behind me. The engine was still dead. I slammed my fist on the dashboard, trying to keep calm, but the fear was overwhelming now. I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. And then I heard it again, but this time it was right outside my window. The same rasping voice, clear as day. Help. I glanced to my left, my heart racing as I slowly turned my head. The figure was back. Only this time, it wasn't standing in the trees. It was right outside the car, its face pressed against the glass, its eyes wide, black as pitch, staring at me through the window. I couldn't breathe. Its mouth opened, an unnatural smile spreading across its face. The whisper came again, now more urgent, more forceful. "Help! You can't leave. Not now." I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas, the tires spinning as I tore down the road, the figure disappearing behind me. My hands were still shaking, and the flashlight still clutched in my grip. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing me. But there was nothing. Just empty road. I kept driving for miles, eyes glued to the road ahead, my mind racing. I needed to get away, but every turn I took, every stretch of road felt like I was going deeper into something that didn't want me to leave. The gas gauge was still on empty. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know if I would ever make it out, and then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I saw it. Just ahead, a flicker of light. A gas station. Sitting alone at the side of the road, almost like it was waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled into the station, the car jerking to a stop, the engine finally cutting out. I stepped out, still shaken, still feeling the presence of that thing, watching from the dark. I walked toward the pump, but as I stepped under the harsh fluorescent lights, I noticed something strange. The gas station wasn't empty. There was someone inside, a man sitting behind the counter watching me with an odd, knowing smile. I stopped. He didn't move, just watched me, and then, softly, barely audible, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." My blood ran cold. I turned and ran back to the car, the sound of the man's voice echoing in my mind. I drove off, away from the station, away from whatever it was that was waiting there. And as I glanced in the rearview mirror,
Story number 3.
it was supposed to be a quick drive. I had been stuck at work all week, and I was looking forward to a peaceful drive to clear my head. The sun was setting as I pulled onto Highway 14, a winding road that cut through the woods, heading toward the nearest town. I had taken this route before, but something felt different tonight, like the world was holding its breath. The drive was quiet at first, just the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees that bordered the road. I checked the fuel gauge. A quarter tank left. I'd be fine, I told myself. I had plenty of gas to make it to the next town, or so I thought. But as the minutes stretched on, I started to feel the distance. There were no more signs for towns. No other cars had passed for what felt like hours. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, twisting and turning, and I began to feel a creeping unease. The trees were growing denser, their shadows more oppressive, the darkness thickening around me. I glanced at the fuel gauge again. The needle was dangerously close to empty. Panic flickered in my chest. I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. There had to be one coming up. There had to be. I wasn't familiar with the road, but I remembered seeing signs earlier for a town just a few miles ahead. But now, nothing. The road seemed endless, and I couldn't even see a single light in the distance. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, willing the car to go faster, but the engine sputtered in protest. The headlights flickered, the dashboard lights dimmed, and then nothing. The engine died. I was coasting now, the car slowing down, rolling to a stop on the side of the road. I sat in silence for a moment, staring at the empty road ahead. The night had settled in fully, and the woods around me were dark and thick. The only sound was the rustling of leaves, but even that felt too loud, like the night was alive. I checked my phone. No signal. Great. No gas, no signal, and no way to get help. I opened the car door and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a wall, the chill seeping into my bones. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but there was nothing. No lights in the distance, just the road and the trees closing in around me. I thought I saw a flicker of light in the distance, maybe from a house or another car. I squinted, hoping for some sign of life, but the light disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I shook my head. It had to be my imagination, right? I had to find a way out of here. The idea of walking through the woods alone was terrifying, but staying here felt even worse. I started walking along the side of the road, hoping to find something, anything. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more the road seemed to stretch out in front of me, farther than I remembered. I turned back, thinking I had gotten turned around, but the road looked different now. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting into strange shapes, casting shadows that looked like hands reaching for me. The light from the flashlight I'd grabbed flickered in the growing darkness, and the wind started to pick up, howling through the trees. It was getting colder. I was lost. I could feel it now. I was lost, and I was alone. Suddenly, I heard something. A car. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. I turned to look, hoping for help, but all I saw was the flickering of headlights down the road, far away. The car was coming toward me, slowly, the headlights cutting through the night. Relief washed over me, and I stepped into the road, waving my arms to get their attention. But the car didn't slow down. It kept coming, getting closer, its lights blinding. I thought maybe the driver hadn't seen me, so I stepped closer, desperate for help. The car was almost on top of me now, and just as it passed, I saw the driver's face through the window. A pale, gaunt face, eyes hollow, staring straight ahead. The car sped by without slowing. My heart skipped a beat as I watched it disappear into the darkness. What the hell? I turned back toward where the car had passed, but it was gone. No taillights, no sound, just silence. The road stretched out in front of me, empty again. I staggered back, a sense of dread creeping over me. Something wasn't right. I shouldn't have stayed out here. I should have waited for help at the car. The woods around me seemed to grow darker, the trees casting long shadows across the road, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. I turned back toward my car, the one that had broken down, but the path didn't look the same anymore. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, as if it was mocking me. I had walked, but I hadn't made any progress. I walked faster now, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the thick silence. I had to get back. I had to get out of here, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the road, a small figure standing in the distance. A person? No, it couldn't be. I could barely make out the shape, but it looked like a child, standing motionless in the dark. I called out to them, but they didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Hey, are you okay? No response. I took another step, but the figure was gone. I stopped, confused, looking around. The road was empty again. No sign of the figure, no sound, just the trees swaying in the wind. And then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but then it grew louder, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like voices. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it wasn't normal. It was something darker. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. Nothing but the trees. I started to run. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from the voices. My mind was racing. I needed to get back to the car. I needed to find help. But the road stretched on and the trees closed in tighter around me. I ran faster, my breath coming in gasps, and that's when I realized. I wasn't moving forward anymore. The road had changed. The trees that had once seemed far away were now surrounding me. The path ahead seemed to bend, twisting unnaturally, and I was stuck in the loop. The voices came again, louder now, clearer. Stay with us. The road never ended. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The trip back from the cabin was supposed to be a quick, uneventful drive. I had done it a dozen times before, but this time the gas gauge crept dangerously close to empty. I cursed under my breath. I'd meant to fill up before leaving, but the gas station in the small town near the cabin had been closed. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how far you are from civilization. The tall pines lining the road seemed to close in on me as the darkness thickened. My phone showed no signal, and the GPS had given up trying to track me miles ago. A gas station finally appeared up ahead, the glowing red sign a beacon in the night. My heart lifted as I pulled into the lot. It wasn't much, just 2 pumps and a small convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. But it was enough. I parked next to the pump and grabbed my wallet. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp and biting. A shiver ran down my spine, though I told myself it was just the weather. The pump was an older model, the kind that didn't take cards. Great. I'd have to go inside to pay. I glanced at the convenience store, its dimly lit interior barely visible through the grimy windows. There was no sign of anyone inside, but the door was open and a faint flickering light came from the back. As I pushed the door open, a bell jingled, its sound oddly muffled. The store was empty, the air stale and thick with the smell of mildew. Shelves lined with outdated snacks and faded magazines stretched toward the back where the flickering light came from. "Hello?" I called out. My voice seemed to vanish into the stillness. No answer. I stepped deeper inside, scanning the counter for a bell or some way to get the attendant's attention. Instead, I found a handwritten sign taped to the register. "Back in 5 minutes." Frustrated, I decided to wait. I leaned against the counter, tapping my fingers. But as the seconds ticked by, an uneasy feeling began to settle over me. The store felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The flickering light in the back caught my eye again. It wasn't a light bulb. It was a TV, an old tube model sitting on a stack of boxes. The screen was filled with static, the kind that buzzes faintly if you listen closely. And then it changed. The static morphed into an image. A car broken down on the side of a road. My car, my license plate. My heart skipped a beat. "What the hell?" I whispered. The image flickered, and now it showed me standing inside the gas station, looking at the TV. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. A loud crash came from behind me. I spun around, but the store was empty. The door I'd come through was now closed, though I didn't remember shutting it. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. The only response was the TV. The screen now showed the gas station's lot, but something was wrong. The pumps were gone, replaced by gravestones. The sign out front was shattered, the red letters spelling out nothing but gibberish. And then a figure appeared on the screen. It was standing in the lot, facing the store. Facing me. I turned back to the windows, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there, just the empty pumps and the shadowy outline of the forest beyond. But when I looked back at the TV, the figure was closer, halfway to the door now. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, yanking it open, but the lot outside was different. The forest was gone, replaced by an endless, barren expanse of cracked asphalt stretching into the darkness. I ran to my car, but it wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, the gas gauge inexplicably back on empty. My heart pounded as I looked around, desperate for any sign of life. And then I saw it. The figure from the TV was standing at the edge of the lot, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its steps echoing in the unnatural stillness. I locked myself in the car, fumbling for my phone. Still no signal. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming clearer. It had no face, just smooth, featureless skin stretched over a humanoid skull. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. It didn't stop. It reached the car, its long, spindly fingers tapping against the driver's side window. The sound was soft at first, then louder, more insistent. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're out of gas." The car door unlocked itself with a soft click. The figure's hand reached for the handle. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The Vanishing Rest Stop. It was a road I'd driven 100 times before, long, empty, and endlessly boring. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, the sky darker than usual, even for a moonless night. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept driving. The gas gauge was dipping toward empty, and I silently cursed my laziness. I should have filled up before leaving the city, but I'd convinced myself I'd have enough to make it home. Now, the needle was in the red, and there wasn't a gas station for miles. Then, as if answering my silent prayer, a sign appeared on the side of the road. "Next rest stop, 1 mile." Relief washed over me. When I reached it, the place looked ancient, like something out of an old movie. A small convenience store sat under a single flickering light, and 2 rusted gas pumps stood at the edge of the cracked pavement. The sign above the building read, "Easy Gas and Groceries." It didn't look like much, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I pulled up to one of the pumps, turned off the engine. The night was deathly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. As I stepped out of the car, a cold breeze swept through, sending a shiver down my spine. The pump looked like it hadn't been used in decades, its metal casing faded and pitted with rust. I lifted the nozzle and tried to insert it into the tank, but nothing happened. I checked the pump's display, but it was blank. "Figures," I muttered. The lights inside the store were on, though, so I decided to head in and see if I could get help. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled above my head. The interior was just as old and run down as the exterior. Dusty shelves stocked with faded packages, and a counter with a cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum. Behind the counter stood a man, or at least something that resembled one. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken and glassy. He didn't look up as I approached. Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Pump's not working." The man slowly raised his head, his movements unnaturally stiff. His eyes locked onto mine, and I immediately regretted coming inside. They were unnerving, too bright, almost reflective, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. "No gas," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "What do you mean, no gas?" I asked. "This is a gas station." The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached under the counter and placed a small, old-fashioned oil lamp on the surface. The flame flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "You should leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "What are you talking about?" "Leave," he repeated, "before it finds you." A loud thud came from outside, cutting through the silence. I spun around, my heart pounding. The sound came again, this time from the direction of my car. I ran outside, scanning the lot. The car was there, but the front tire was flat, deflated as if something had slashed it. The air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. A low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness beyond the rest stop's lights. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The growl came again, louder this time, and I saw movement at the edge of the light. A shadow, impossibly tall and distorted, slipped between the trees that bordered the lot. I bolted back toward the store, but the door wouldn't budge. The lights inside were off now, and the man was gone. The only illumination came from the flickering neon sign above the pumps. The growling grew closer, and I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. Something was standing at the edge of the lot. Its shape was wrong. Too long, too thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixed on me. I scrambled toward the car, yanking the door open and jumping inside. I locked the doors and fumbled for the keys, my hands trembling. The engine roared to life, but the gas gauge was empty, the needle buried in the red. Come on, I muttered, slamming the pedal to the floor. The car sputtered and lurched forward, but it wasn't enough. The creature was moving now, its twisted form darting closer with unnatural speed. I turned the wheel, driving off the lot and back onto the highway. The car rattled as it struggled to move, the flat tire thudding against the pavement. In the rearview mirror, the creature was still following, its limbs stretching and contorting as it closed the distance. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, the headlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. I couldn't tell if I was making progress or just driving in circles. The creature's growls grew louder, echoing all around me. And then, suddenly, the car stopped. The engine died, the headlights flickered, and the world was plunged into silence. I sat there, frozen, as the growling surrounded me. The windows began to fog up, and handprints appeared on the glass, too many to count. A faint whisper filled the car, repeating a single phrase over and over. "You're out of gas." The last thing I saw was the creature's glowing eyes in the rearview mirror, inches from my face, before everything went black. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I always loved late-night drives. There was something about the stillness of the road, the hum of the engine, and the endless darkness that calmed me. But this drive was different. It was just after midnight, and I was on a back road cutting through the forest, heading home from a visit to an old friend. I had the windows cracked, the cool night air rushing in as my favorite playlist hummed softly in the background. The gas gauge hovered near the quarter tank mark, and I figured I had enough to make it to the next station. But as the miles rolled on, the gauge started dropping faster than it should. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I tapped the glass, hoping it was a malfunction, but the needle kept creeping toward empty. The road stretched endlessly ahead, no lights, no other cars, just the forest pressing in on either side. My GPS had stopped working a while back, and my phone had no signal. Perfect. I started scanning the sides of the road, looking for a gas station, a house, anything. Then, as if in answer to my silent prayer, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, a hitchhiker. At first, I thought about driving past. Picking up strangers in the middle of the night? That's how horror stories start. But then I noticed the woman looked young, maybe in her 20s, and she was holding a small backpack. She didn't seem dangerous. Besides, the road was too desolate, and I couldn't just leave her there. I slowed the car and rolled down the passenger window. "You okay?" I called out. She stepped closer, her face illuminated by the headlights. She was pale, with long dark hair that framed her face like a curtain. Her expression was neutral, almost eerily calm. "I ran out of gas," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Can you give me a ride to the next station?" I hesitated, glancing at my own gas gauge. "Sure," I said finally. "Hop in." She slid into the passenger seat without a word, placing her backpack on her lap. I couldn't help but notice how cold the air suddenly felt inside the car, like someone had opened a freezer. I chalked it up to nerves. As I pulled back onto the road, the silence between us grew heavy. She stared straight ahead, her hands resting on the backpack, not fidgeting, not moving at all. It was unnerving. I tried to break the tension. "So where were you heading?" She didn't look at me. "Anywhere but here." I laughed awkwardly. "Fair enough. What happened to your car?" "Just stopped working," she said. Her tone was flat, emotionless. The unease in my chest grew. Something about her felt off. The way she spoke, the way she barely moved, it was like she wasn't entirely present. I decided to keep my focus on the road. The forest seemed denser now, the trees taller and more twisted. The headlights barely pierced the darkness light, and the road looked unfamiliar, even though I hadn't turned off it. My grip on the wheel tightened. "Do you know how far the gas station is?" I asked. "Not far," she replied. "Just keep driving." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, and for a split second, I thought I saw her reflection in the window. But it wasn't right. Her face was distorted, her eyes black and hollow. I blinked, and it was gone. Just her normal face staring blankly ahead. My breath hitched. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. The road began to twist and turn unnaturally, the trees pressing closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the car. The gas gauge was now on empty, the warning light blinking angrily. "I think we're almost out of gas," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "You'll make it," she said, her tone sharper now. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed at me to stop the car, to tell her to get out, but something about her presence made it impossible to move against her. It was like she had rooted me to my seat. Suddenly she spoke again. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I froze. The question came out of nowhere, her voice cold and detached. Not really," I lied. "Why?" She turned her head slowly to look at me, her eyes locking onto mine. They were darker than I remembered, almost bottomless. A faint smile played on her lips. "Because you're driving into one." My stomach dropped. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, or what was left of it. The asphalt ended abruptly, dropping off into a black void. "What the hell?" I whispered, staring at the edge. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, and her backpack was gone. My heart raced as I scanned the road, the forest, the darkness. She had vanished. And then I heard it, a faint tapping on the back window. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own. In the mirror, I saw her face pressed against the glass, grinning. Her voice echoed in the car, though her lips didn't move. "You're out of gas." The car engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered before going out completely, plunging me into total darkness. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a quick drive, a shortcut the GPS had promised, cutting through a lonely stretch of countryside called Whispering Hills. I'd never heard of it before, but I didn't question it. I just wanted to get home. The road was narrow, bordered by endless fields that glowed silver under the light of the full moon. The isolation was oddly comforting at first, but the further I drove, the more uneasy I felt. My gas gauge was hovering over empty, the warning light blinking persistently. I was sure I'd filled up before starting this trip. Yet here I was, on a deserted road, miles from anywhere, running on fumes. I told myself to stay calm. There had to be a gas station eventually. But as the road wound deeper into the hills, the landscape became stranger. The fields seemed to stretch unnaturally far, the grass swaying even though there was no wind. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any. And then, up ahead, I saw it. A gas station. Relief flooded me. The building was old and weathered, its neon sign flickering weakly. Whispering Hills Fuel, it read. It looked out of place, like it belonged to another time entirely. But I didn't care. I pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under my tires, and parked next to the pump. I stepped out of the car and immediately noticed how quiet it was. Not just quiet, silent. No crickets, no rustling trees, no distant hum of life. Just nothing. The pump was ancient, the kind with a spinning dial instead of a digital screen. I grabbed the nozzle and tried to start the flow of gas, but nothing happened. I looked around for an attendant, but the station seemed deserted. That's when I noticed the sign in the window. Pay inside. With a sigh, I headed toward the building. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled faintly overhead. The interior was dimly lit, the shelves lined with dusty cans and faded packages. The air smelled faintly of oil and something metallic. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I approached the counter, where an old cash register sat beneath a single flickering bulb. There was a notebook lying open next to it. The pages were filled with names, each written in jagged, shaky handwriting. At the bottom of the list, there was a fresh entry. My name. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The bell jingled again, but I hadn't moved the door. It was swinging on its own, the breeze non-existent. Running out of gas was a mistake, a voice rasped behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the shadows, deeper and darker than they should have been. The voice came again, this time from my left. "You shouldn't have come here." "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The shadows seemed to move, pooling together in the corner of the room. Slowly, they began to take shape. A tall, indistinct figure with glowing white eyes. It didn't walk. It glided, closing the distance between us without a sound. I bolted for the door, shoving it open and sprinting back to my car. The pump nozzle was still hanging from the tank, but I didn't care. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the gas gauge hadn't budged. Empty. I slammed the pedal to the floor anyway, the tires spinning on the gravel before catching. The car lurched forward, the station disappearing in my rearview mirror. But the road ahead wasn't the same. It twisted unnaturally, splitting and merging in ways that didn't make sense. The fields were gone, replaced by a dense, foggy forest. I drove faster, the trees pressing closer, their gnarled branches reaching for the car. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog, and I had to swerve to avoid the shapes that darted across the road, animals or something pretending to be them. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing inside the car. "You can't leave," I screamed, gripping the wheel tighter. The car sputtered and slowed, the engine gasping like a dying breath. No matter how hard I pressed the pedal, it wouldn't go any faster. The headlights flickered, and the forest seemed to shift. Figures stood among the trees now, their glowing eyes watching, waiting. And then the car stopped completely. The radio turned on by itself, static hissing through the speakers. Beneath it, I could hear whispers, faint, indistinct, but growing louder. They filled the car, rising to a deafening cacophony. I opened the door and ran, stumbling onto the road. The forest closed in around me, the figures stepping out of the shadows, their eyes fixed on me. "You're out of gas," they said in unison, their voices overlapping like a broken record. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures surrounded me, their hands cold and claw-like as they reached for me. The last thing I saw was the flickering neon sign of the gas station, far in the distance, before the darkness swallowed me whole. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I had always been one of those people who pushed their luck with an empty gas tank. It's fine, I tell myself. I can make it to the next station. But that night, the gamble didn't pay off. I was driving back from a work trip, exhausted and desperate to get home. The highway was a barren stretch of asphalt with no signs of life except for the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight. The needle on my gas gauge hovered ominously over E, and I knew I needed to find a station soon. As if on cue, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. Last Chance Gas. The name felt a little too on the nose, but I didn't care. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the station, the tires crunching on loose gravel. The place looked ancient. The paint on the building was peeling, and the single gas pump was a relic from the 1950s. A dim light glowed from inside the small convenience store, and a shadow moved across the window. At least someone was here. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the neon sign above. I grabbed the nozzle and started filling up. The pump was slow, the numbers on the display ticking upward like they were stuck in molasses. As I waited, I glanced toward the convenience store. The shadow I'd seen earlier was still moving, pacing back and forth. Something about it unsettled me. It didn't move like a person. The gait was jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I was just tired, I told myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I replaced the nozzle and headed inside to pay. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped in, and a wave of stale air hit me. The store was dimly lit, the shelves sparsely stocked with dusty bags of chips and faded candy wrappers. Behind the counter stood a man, or at least something that resembled one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin a sickly gray that didn't look right under the fluorescent light. His eyes didn't meet mine, instead staring somewhere over my shoulder. "Just the gas," I said, sliding a 20 across the counter. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, his lips twitching slightly as if trying to form words. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. His head jerked suddenly like he'd been snapped out of a trance. His eyes finally met mine, and I wished they hadn't. They were pitch black, no whites, no pupils, just an endless void. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rasping. I took a step back, every instant my body screaming at me to leave. But before I could move, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. Panic set in. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the empty space where the man had been standing. He was gone. The door jingled behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The parking lot outside was empty, my car sitting alone under the flickering neon sign. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as if they were alive. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped outside, the air felt heavier, colder. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting strange warped shapes across the ground. The gas station looked different now, older, more decayed. The windows were boarded up, the pump rusted and covered in vines. I ran to my car, yanked the door open, and jumped inside. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, gravel spraying behind me as I sped back onto the highway. But the relief was short-lived. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, the same patch of asphalt repeating over and over. The trees lining the sides of the highway looked identical, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The man from the gas station was sitting in the back seat, his black eyes staring at me through the mirror, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You're out of gas," he whispered, though the tank had just been filled. The engine sputtered, the car jerking violently as it lost power. The headlights flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. And then, silence. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was late, way later than I should have been on the road. I had left the city hours ago, and now there was nothing but open highway ahead. I could feel my eyelids heavy, my mind drifting in that in-between state where you're awake but not quite all there. The roads were empty, silent, the kind of silence that gets under your skin. I checked the fuel gauge. The needle was nearing empty, but I thought I could make it to the next town. Stupid mistake, I know. I should have filled up earlier, but I kept telling myself the gas station was just up ahead. But the miles kept stretching on, and the trees on either side of the road looked more and more like shadows, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The engine sputtered, a brief, ominous cough, and then the car lurched. No, no, no! I slammed my foot on the pedal, but it was too late. The car rolled to a stop, the engine groaning in defeat. I was out of gas. I cursed under my breath. Of course, this would happen now, in the middle of nowhere, at the worst possible time. The dashboard flickered, and for a moment everything seemed to dim. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I pulled the key from the ignition, but the night felt too still. Too quiet. I was alone, but it didn't feel like it. I looked around. No lights, no signs of civilization for miles. My phone, of course, had no signal. There was no way I was walking for help. The thought alone sent a chill through me, imagining the vast emptiness of the road stretching endlessly before me. I sighed and grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. I wasn't far from the next exit, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting me with a gust that made me shiver. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a stretch of road that seemed endless. I could feel my breath quicken, a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. It wasn't until I turned back toward the car that I noticed something in the distance. A light. It flickered, far off to the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. A house? A farm? I couldn't be sure, but I figured it was worth checking out. Maybe someone lived there, and maybe they could help me. I started walking toward the light. As I drew closer, the shadows grew darker, the night colder. The air seemed to thicken around me, as if the world was holding its breath. The beam of my flashlight swayed as I moved, catching glimpses of the overgrown path ahead. And then, the light went out. I stopped dead in my tracks, breath caught in my throat. The road in front of me seemed to stretch longer now, more oppressive. The trees swayed in the wind, but they didn't seem to make a sound. Everything was wrong. A voice low and distant came from somewhere nearby. Help. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear. It was more like a whisper, carried by the wind, or maybe it was something else. My heart pounded in my chest. It couldn't be real. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the voice came again, closer this time. Help me. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The voice was coming from behind me. I spun around quickly, the flashlight beam cutting through the air. But there was nothing. Just the empty road, the trees, the night. I was imagining things. I had to be. Then a sound. A faint scratching like nails dragging across stone coming from the dark woods on the edge of the road. My breath hitched. My breath hitched. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back in the car, but I couldn't move. Something had me rooted to the spot. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something moving in the shadows at the edge of the woods. A figure, pale and gaunt, drifting between the trees. It didn't walk. It glided, its feet not touching the ground. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure moved closer, and I could see it more clearly now. A woman, her long hair hanging in tangled knots around her face, her skin an unnatural shade of pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were wide, too wide, empty pits of blackness. I stumbled backward, my legs refusing to cooperate, my mind scrambling for some explanation. Was it a hallucination? Was I still dreaming? But it didn't matter. The figure was real, and it was coming for me. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice now clear but empty of emotion. I could feel her gaze, cold and piercing, as she reached out toward me. Her hand was long, too long, and her fingers twisted unnaturally as they reached for my face. I turned and bolted back toward the car, but the road seemed to stretch farther than it had before. The car was so far away now, the light from the headlights barely visible in the distance. My breath was ragged as I ran, faster than I thought I could. But no matter how quickly I moved, it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, like the night itself was closing in. I reached the car, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it, panting in fear. The engine, of course, wouldn't start. My hands shook as I turned the key, the dashboard flickering, but nothing happened. Outside, I could hear it now, the soft dragging sound like nails on glass getting closer. The woman's whisper was louder, almost deafening in my ears. "Help me." I looked out the window, but there was nothing, just the empty road, the dark woods, and the oppressive silence. But I knew, deep down, she was still there, just waiting. She was waiting for me to leave the car, to make the wrong move. And that was when I realized I was never supposed to be on this road. Not at this hour, not with no gas. And now I was trapped. I tried again to start the car, my hands trembling, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't turn on. The last thing I remember is the screeching sound, like 1,000 nails scraping against a chalkboard, coming from just outside the window, and then the cold breath on the back of my neck, and everything went dark. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
It was late, and I was pushing my old sedan farther than I should have. I had a bad habit of waiting until the last possible moment to fill up the tank, and tonight, it had finally caught up with me. The gas gauge needle dipped below empty as I crept along a dark, winding road surrounded by nothing but endless woods. My GPS was no help. It kept recalculating and pointing me back to a highway I had no idea how to reach. I should have been scared, but mostly I was frustrated. It felt like I'd been driving in circles. Then, through the gloom, I saw it. A small intersection with a single flickering streetlight. Just beyond it was an old-fashioned gas station. Its sign glowed faintly, reading, "Last Chance Fuel." "Perfect," I muttered, pulling into the lot. The place looked deserted. The building was weathered, its windows opaque with grime. A single pump stood under the pale light, like rusted but functional looking. I parked and got out, shivering as a chill breeze swept through the night. I grabbed the nozzle and began fueling up, relieved when the pump actually worked. The numbers on the dial spun slowly, and I leaned against the car watching my surroundings. The silence was unsettling. No animals, no wind, just the faint hum of the flickering light. That's when I noticed the road signs at the intersection. They were strange. One sign read, "Nowhere Road, Row," and the other said, "Endless Way." I laughed nervously. "Weird sense of humor out here," I mumbled. A movement in the corner of my eye made me turn sharply. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. A tall figure, still and watching. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no answer. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I hurriedly replaced the nozzle and got back into the car, locking the doors. The figure was gone, but my unease lingered. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I decided to head down Nowhere Road. The GPS wouldn't load, so I figured I'd just keep driving until I found a more familiar route. But something was off. The road seemed endless, the same stretch of pavement and trees repeating over and over. I tried turning around, but the intersection appeared again, no matter which direction I went. I stopped the car and stared at the signs. The streetlight above them buzzed loudly, casting harsh shadows that danced unnaturally across the pavement. Then I saw it. The figure from before was back, standing beneath the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, with arms that so long and the head that tilted unnaturally to one side. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. I slammed the gas pedal and sped down endless way. The car roared forward, the tires screeching against the road. The figure didn't move, but its presence clung to me, heavy and suffocating. I drove for what felt like hours, but no matter how far I went, the intersection always reappeared. Each time, the figure was closer. First by the woods, then by the pump, then standing directly beneath the streetlight. Finally, I stopped the car again, too exhausted and terrified to keep driving. The figure was now just a few feet away, its head twitching as if trying to decide whether to come closer. Desperation overtook me. I leaned out the window and shouted, "What do you want?" The figure's head snapped toward me, and for the first time it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at the gas station. I didn't want to go back, but something about its gesture left me no choice. With shaking hands, I turned the car around and parked at the pump once more. The figure was gone. The building, which had been dark before, now glowed faintly. I stepped out of the car and approached it, my legs feeling like lead. Inside, the shelves were stocked with items that looked decades old. Canned goods with faded labels, glass bottles of soda, and packages of gum that probably hadn't been touched in years. Behind the counter was a man. He was thin and pale, with sunken eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Lost?" he asked, his voice hollow. I nodded, unable to speak. "You ran out of gas on the wrong road," he said, his smile widening unnaturally. "That happens a lot out here." "I just want to leave," I managed to choke out. The man tilted his head, much like the figure had. "Oh, you can leave," he said, "but you have to pay first." I reached for my wallet, fumbling to pull out cash. The man laughed, a dry, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. "Not with money," he said, leaning forward. "With time." Before I could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the air grew cold. Whispers filled the space, low and unintelligible, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. I stumbled back toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, and I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and skeletal. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. The man, the whispers, the unnatural cold, all of it was gone. I ran out to my car and drove. This time, the intersection didn't reappear. The gas station faded in the rearview mirror like a mirage. But my relief was short-lived. The gas gauge, which had been full just moments ago, was empty again. And when I looked in the mirror, the figure was there, sitting in the back seat, its head tilted at that impossible angle. "You're out of gas," it whispered.
Story number 11.
The plan was simple, just a late-night drive to clear my head. No real destination, just the open road and the hum of the engine to keep me company. I liked it that way. The silence of the highway always felt like freedom, a chance to leave everything behind for a while. But tonight, the road felt wrong. It started with the gas gauge. I was sure I had filled the tank before I left, but as I glanced down at it, the needle was already creeping toward empty. I frowned, doing the math in my head. No way I'd used that much fuel already. Shrugging it off as a glitch, I kept driving. The highway was dark, lined with dense trees that seemed to crowd the edges of the road. No signs, no other cars, just me and the asphalt stretching endlessly ahead. The gauge dipped lower. A cold knot of unease formed in my stomach. I hadn't passed a gas station in miles, and my phone showed no signal. I was starting to wonder if I'd missed a turn or taken the wrong road entirely. That's when I saw it. A flicker of neon in the distance, a gas station sign. Relief washed over me. The sign was old and faint, the letters barely legible, but I didn't care. I pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under my tires, and parked next to the lone pump. The station was eerily quiet. A single flickering bulb cast weak light over the cracked pavement. The building itself looked abandoned, windows smeared with grime, a sagging roof, but the pump seemed to work, and that's all I cared about. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. I grabbed the nozzle, slid my card into the reader, and waited. Nothing happened. I tried again, but the screen stayed blank. Frustrated, I leaned back against the car, looking around. That's when I noticed the door to the station was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Something about this place felt off, like it didn't belong here, but I didn't have a choice. I needed gas, and if someone was inside, maybe they could help. I walked toward the door, my boots crunching on the gravel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. I pushed the door open wider, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside. Shelves half empty, dust thick on every surface. The air smelled stale, like something left to rot. I stepped inside. "Anyone here?" I called again. The sound of a faint shuffle came from the back of the store. My heart skipped. I peered around a corner expecting to see a clerk, but there was no one. Just an empty aisle of expired snacks. The shuffle came again, louder this time from deeper in the store. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling now. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision. I spun around, but nothing was there. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or some other animal that had wandered in. But as I backed away, the shuffling turned into a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the store. I froze, my breath hitching. The dragging sound grew closer, and now I could hear something else, a low, guttural breathing. I grabbed the flashlight from my pocket and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light landed on a trail of dark, wet smears leading from the back of the store toward me. Panic set in. I bolted for the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something on the other side was holding it shut. I turned back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The dragging sound was right behind me now. My light caught a glimpse of something. A figure crouched low, its limbs too long, its face obscured in shadow. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. It just moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking. I backed away, my flashlight beam flickering. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was rasping, broken, like it hadn't been used in years. My blood turned to ice. The figure lunged, and I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows on the walls. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, and ran toward the back of the store, desperate to find another exit. I found a door marked storage. I threw it open and slammed it behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The storage room was pitch black, the air thick and suffocating. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The dragging sound had stopped. For a moment, all was silent. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from behind me. "You can't leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. My hands fumbled for the flashlight in my pocket, but when I clicked it on, it didn't work. I was plunged into darkness, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whisper came again, louder this time, right next to my ear. "You'll stay," I screamed, pounding on the door, desperate to get out. The handle turned, and I stumbled forward into the main store, tripping over something soft. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. It was me. My body, lying lifeless on the floor, my face frozen in terror. The figure stood over it, watching me with hollow black eyes, its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. "You ran out of gas," it said. "Now you're ours." The lights flickered once, then went out completely. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The night was swallowing me whole, the road ahead an endless ribbon of black stretching out towards something I couldn't see. It had been hours since I passed the last town, and I had no idea how far I was from civilization. All I knew was that I was running low on gas, and I still hadn't found a station. But I told myself I was fine. I could make it. I had to. But then the engine stuttered. For a second, I thought it was just the bumps in the road. But then, it happened again. This time louder, a sharp jerk that made me grip the wheel hard. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was sitting on empty. I cursed under my breath, the dim lights of the car barely illuminating the road ahead. There was nothing but darkness around me. No houses, no streetlights, just an empty highway surrounded by dense trees on both sides. I looked at my phone. No signal. Great. Just great. I pulled over to the shoulder, the tires crunching on the gravel. The hum of the engine died, and the night settled into a heavy silence. For a second, I just sat there, staring ahead, thinking, should I walk to find help? But the thought of trekking through the pitch-black woods alone, no thanks. I opened the door, hoping the cold night air would clear my head. I could see a faint glow in the distance. Headlights, maybe? A car coming? I glanced at my car one last time and sighed. I'll wait for someone, I muttered to myself. But the eerie quiet around me didn't feel right. My skin prickled as I waited, feeling exposed like I was being watched. Then the sound came. A soft, almost melodic whisper. It was so faint that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it at first. But then it came again, louder. A voice, but it wasn't human. It didn't sound like any language I knew, just a series of low, elongated sounds like someone was calling out in the distance, pleading, reaching. I froze. My breath hitched in my chest. There was no one here. There was no one around for miles. I turned to face the trees. The whispering was getting clearer now, more urgent, but still not a word I could understand. My eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A shape, far in the distance. A figure standing between the trees watching me. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying branches. But no, there was something about it that felt wrong. Something unnatural. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and as it moved, its limbs jerked at strange angles. It looked like a person, but not quite. A shiver ran down my spine. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus echoing from the darkness surrounding me. Panic set in. I backed up, my hands scrambling to find the door handle, but my legs felt like lead. I could barely move. The figure started to move toward me, slow, deliberate, its shape warping in and out of the darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard the whispers again, this time clearer. Help me. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding, and I was paralyzed with fear. The figure was closer now, so close I could see its eyes, black, hollow, like deep voids that sucked in every bit of light. Its mouth opened, stretching wider than it should, and I could hear it clearly now, the whisper that was more like a guttural growl. You're next. I yanked open the door, stumbling inside the car. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The whispers were growing louder, like they were right outside the car now, pressing in on me from all sides. I slammed my foot on the gas, but the engine just sputtered and died. I tried again, but nothing. The car wouldn't start. The figure was standing right outside now, its face inches from the window, its eyes so wide that they seemed to bulge out of its skull. I could smell something rancid, like rot. My stomach twisted, and I almost gagged. With my heart in my throat, I scrambled to unlock the door, desperate to get out of the car and run. I glanced around, searching for any sign of help, but the road was empty, the trees closing in, blocking the light from the stars above. Help me, it whispered again, but now it was unmistakably close, like the words were coming from just outside the window. The air in the car grew cold, so cold that I could see my breath fogging up the window. I knew I had to do something. I had to get out of here. I tried the engine again. Nothing. My mind raced, and I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. There was no way out. But then, suddenly I saw something. At the edge of my vision, just past the trees, a car appeared. A set of headlights cutting through the darkness. A real car, but a rescue. My heart leapt in my chest, relief flooding over me. Someone was coming. But just as quickly, the headlights flickered. The car slowed down. It wasn't coming toward me. It was stopping, right in the middle of the road. I couldn't see the driver, but I could hear a faint, guttural laugh drifting toward me from the vehicle. The figure outside the car stepped back, its face turning toward the new car, its twisted mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. And then, slowly, it turned to face me again. I was about to scream for help when something even worse happened. The car's headlights dimmed. The figure in the road turned, walking toward it, toward that car, and disappeared into the shadows. The whispers, now a cacophony of voices, filled my ears, their words still unclear but unmistakable. "You're not safe here." Suddenly, the engine of my own car roared to life. The dashboard flickered once more, then illuminated. The whispers stopped. The car was ready to go. I didn't question it. I floored the gas pedal, tearing down the road, not looking back, not daring to. And as I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, but I could still hear the whispers. "You're next." Story the end.